pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Few of us realize today that when the great unpleasantness began, no one could be sure whether this city would wind up as a capital of the Union or of the Confederacy. Months before the war began, riots and rumors and plots kept Washington in a state of high tension and emotion. It began with scenes like what happened at the Tremont House at Indiana Avenue and 2nd Street on the night of November 6, Election Day, 1860. Hiding on the roof of the gutted building just 3 blocks from the Capitol, a handful of scared young Lincoln fans peeked down at a mob in the street that was shouting, "Burn the building, burn it down." All that fall, boisterous Republicans who call themselves wide awakes had marched in northern cities waving torches and carrying fence rails to show their enthusiasm for Abe Lincoln, the great rail splitter. But in Washington, surrounded by Southern partisans, they'd kept quiet until the last weeks when Lincoln's victory seemed likely. Then they paraded openly, defying taunts and showers of rocks from pro-slavery ruffians. And late on election evening, they gathered to greet the results at their Tremont House headquarters. Loud as they were, these demonstrators had no legal voice in what was coming. Washingtonians couldn't vote for president, so all their excitement was focused on the returns from elsewhere. Pennsylvania Avenue, 7th and C Streets were alive with people streaming from one hotel to another, one political club to another, looking for free drinks and news. A crowd surrounded the telegraph office at Grover's Theater, where the National is today. The comic actor Joe Jefferson kept interrupting the show to announce the latest returns. The audience cheered each Democratic upswing and hissed at Republican successes. At the Democratic Jackson Association, which some on the other side abbreviated as Dem Jack Ass, misleading early bulletins encouraged officers to send for a brass band to lead a celebration. But after tuning up, the musicians went home and the hard truth set in. The disappointed losers milled around Brown's Hotel between 6th and 7th Streets, where one of them dared anybody to admit being a damn black Republican, and set off a mass scrimmage that left a lot of noses bloody. By that time, about 12:30, news from Pennsylvania had confirmed that Lincoln would become a 16th president. The wide awakes were celebrating at their clubhouse when one of them rushed in yelling that a gang of roughnecks was on its way to tear the place down. The Lincoln fans scattered. When the fighting drunk mob arrived, it started firing pistols and throwing rocks, smashing windows and breaking in doors. The few Republicans left retreated to the roof. When police arrived, rioters leaped out windows to escape, and outside they began chanting, "Burn the building, burn it down." The wideawakes trapped on the roof were finally saved when the police arrested some of the wreckers, and the mob marched off singing and shouting until its energy at last flickered out near dawn. That wasn't the end of such scenes in the city. In the most momentous election in the nation's history, Lincoln had won only 39% of the popular vote against a divided opposition. The result inspired more political turbulence than celebration in a capital dominated then by Marylanders, Virginians, and Southern Democrats who'd held power for most of the previous decade. Both Virginia and Maryland had rejected Lincoln by overwhelming margins. Flaming politicians farther south immediately started agitating for secession. Some of them talked secretly of mounting a coup to prevent the president-elect from taking office. The captain of the National Rifles, Washington Militia Company, said he would march his men north to the Susquehanna River to defend Maryland against the Yankees. But Washingtonians, most of them, were more alarmed than inspired by all this clamor. Across the street from us at the Capitol, surrounded by scaffolding, sheets of cast iron, and scattered columns of marble, the architect, Thomas Walter, was near despair. Our country is in the midst of a terrible partisan conflict, he told his son, and we are in the vortex of it. Walter was a tall, imposing Philadelphian, but as tension rose, he wrote that the North looks to me to be insane. It's mere stinking pride of opinion that is this moment moving on to allow the country to be deluged in blood. I have no idea that there will be any appropriation this winter for public works, he wrote. And so the great mission of his life, building the new dome that he had designed, could stop before it was well started. Vendors could still hawk fruit and beer and souvenirs within the hallways of the Capitol, and members could still trade votes in their hideaway watering holes. But Walter feared that his work would halt and the Capitol would stand as it was, seeming decapitated, leaking around the edges of the new construction, some of the brick walls without their marble facings. For 4 weeks after the election, Southern voices in the Capitol were even more dominant than usual because Congress was in recess. President James Buchanan, whom one fellow Democrat had called that damned old wry-necked, squinty-eyed, white-livered scoundrel who disgraces the White House, was squeezed from both sides. The best he could do was a weak warning to South Carolina, where the legislature had scheduled a secession convention to begin that December 17th. Washington, like the president, was caught in the middle. The District of Columbia then had only 75,000 people, 11,000 of them black, just over 3,000 of those slaves. A quarter of the population was born in either Maryland or Virginia, and most of the 47% born in the district were from families in those states. Slaves and ex-slaves were governed by the local black code, which duplicated the laws of slaveholding Maryland when the district was created in 1791. It required free blacks to carry a residence permit or risk being jailed or sold into slavery. And they restricted the way blacks could assemble or worship, drive carriages, race horses, swim in the Potomac, or walk on the streets after 10 p.m. Alexandria, part of the original 10 mile square district laid out by George Washington, had been returned to state jurisdiction in Virginia in 1846. But Georgetown, half a century older than the capital, was still a separate town of some 10,000 within the district. There, in the West End near the White House in Lafayette Park, lived most of the Washington establishment, old-line families, ranking politicians, high military officers, and a diplomatic corps whose principals and staff together then numbered just 44 bodies. Politicians moving between White House and Congress, crinoline ladies moving from receptions to balls and recitals, ne'er-do-wells offering shady deals to visitors, all had to traverse streets deep with mud in winter and clouded by dust in summer. Washington's unfinished Capitol building stood above an unfinished city. The few monumental government buildings bulked far out of scale with scattered brick townhouses, rows of low-rise hotels, and squalid slums. Cattle, pigs, and geese roamed free over broad, empty stretches, including the acreage around the stub of the Washington Monument, where a shortage of funds and vandalism had halted construction at the 156-foot level. Only Pennsylvania Avenue and the adjacent stretch of 7th Street were paved with cobblestones. Along the avenue between Capitol Hill and the White House, Washingtonians tested the gullibility of innocent visitors and the wit of writers like one Dr. George William Bagby. "This city is the paradise of paradoxes," Bagby wrote. "A great, little, splendid, mean, extravagant, poverty-stricken barrack. The one and only absolutely certain thing is the absence of everything that is at all permanent." In his cubbyhole office on Newspaper Row across 14th Street from Willard's, Bagby was one of a tribe of correspondents who whipped out dispatches for cities around the nation, many of them moonlighted while on the payroll of Congress or the executive branch. Bagby wrote that the population of Washington is a floating population. Presidents, senators, honorables, judges, generals, commodores, governors, and the exes of all these congregate here as thick as pickpockets at a horse race. Add ambassadors, plenipotentiaries, lords, counts, barons, chevaliers, captains, lieutenants, claim agents, Negroes, perpetual motion men, fire eaters, Irishmen, plug uglies, Hoosiers, gamblers, Californians, Mexicans, Japanese, Indians, and organ grinders, together with females to match. This mix of transient opportunists was thickest in the hotels and rooming houses that lined both sides of the avenue, from the sweet cake and ginger pop stands at the foot of Capitol Hill to the column Treasury, which is still being built at 15th Street. Halfway along, between 7th and 8th Streets, where the archives now stands, sprawled the Center Market, heaped when seasoned with fruit, vegetables, oysters, shad, and beef, all of it swarming with flies from a canal behind it, a loathsome gulch along what's now Constitution Avenue through the heart of the city. Wiser pedestrians avoided the blocks between the avenue and the canal, a neighborhood called Murder Bay, because of cutthroats and cut-rate prostitutes who infested the slums there. Along the avenue itself, the stranger was likely to be welcomed by a better class of entrepreneur. Visitors checking into Willard's, Brown's, the National, or the Metropolitan Hotel, or stepping up to the bar at one of the fancy saloons on the north side, would encounter gambling house decoys, phony congressmen, and others who claimed to be able to fix appointments or contracts for cash in advance. After Lincoln's election, George Bagby's usual light touch became increasingly blunt. "Blessed with the name of the purest of men, the Capitol has the reputation of Sodom," he wrote. Citing the Bible's warning to ancient Jerusalem, he concluded that Washington will be the greatest capital the world ever saw, or it will be a parched place in the wilderness, a salt land and not inhabited. Not long afterward, Bagby went back to Richmond, whence he came, and was very active there as a journalist during the war. Even before the crisis arose, Southerners and Northerners in Washington had preferred to socialize with their own kind. This clannishness was most pronounced among the women. When protocol threw them together, as at presidential and diplomatic receptions, they still managed to uphold their regional loyalties with averted eyes and conspicuously upturned chins. Mrs. Clement Clay, wife of an Alabama senator, boasted of the twists and turns she went through to avoid meeting that politically sophisticated but socially unpolished New Yorker, Republican, Senator William Seward. Not even to save the nation could be induced to eat his bread, to drink his wine, to enter his domicile, to speak to him, she declared. Seward laughed about the time he broke through her defenses when both were masquerading as fictional characters at a fancy dress ball. Just before Christmas of 1860, many of those invited to the wedding of Congressman John Boulini of Louisiana to Mary Carter, daughter of the capital's most prosperous grocer, realized that it might be the last social fling before disunion. Some of them hoped so. The rosy-cheeked bachelor President Buchanan himself was there, with his niece and White House hostess, the statuesque Harriet Lane. After vows were spoken and Buchanan kissed the bride, the guests mingled, sipping champagne. The president, his head congenitally tilted, as if waiting for the answer to a witty question, sat and shook hands with well-wishers. Sarah Pryor, whose husband Roger was Virginia's most volatile congressman, stood listening, and suddenly there were shouts outside. "What is it?" asked Buchanan, turning to Mrs. Pryor. He said, "Madam, do you suppose the house is on fire?" In the largest sense, it was. Sarah stepped out to investigate. They had Congressman Lawrence Kit was leaping and shouting with joy, waving a telegram. "Thank God, South Carolina seceded." "Oh, thank God," he said. Buchanan sat stunned. Some men cheered, others solemnly gathered up their ladies, hurried to thank the Carters, and departed. Then, pale and shaking, the president asked Mrs. Pryor to send a servant for his carriage. Harriet took his elbow as he stepped out into the cold December rain and trundled home to the White House, wondering what to do. Those 4 months from Lincoln's election to his arrival in Washington and inauguration were full of suspense and melodrama. Desperate, fruitless peace conferences, tearful speeches by departing Southern senators like Jefferson Davis and Judah Benjamin, congressional investigation into alleged Southern plots to kidnap the president-elect and seize power in the Capitol. To avoid the real threat that assassins lay in wait for him in Baltimore, President-elect Lincoln sneaked through in dark of night on his way to Washington. Instead of coming through Baltimore direct from Harrisonburg, where he'd spoken on Washington's birthday, he turned secretly back through Philadelphia. He left Mrs. Lincoln and her 2 sons behind to follow the announced schedule, while he went ahead, escorted by 2 bodyguards, the detective Allen Pinkerton and his Illinois friend Ward Hill Lamont. They arrived in Washington at dawn, 10 hours earlier than expected, at the B&O station, near where Union Station is today, and it surprised the desk clerk at Willard's when they checked in. 10 days later, when Lincoln was sworn in on the east front of the Capitol, old General Winfield Scott had horse artillery standing by in case of trouble, alerted by fears of an attempted coup. Government sharpshooters with binoculars clung to the scaffolding of the incomplete dome that soared over the city. In the 4 earth-shaking years that followed, every block of Washington was witness to courage and cowardice, sacrifice and suffering. Each day, soldiers, bureaucrats, speculators, prostitutes, prisoners, spies, and casualties swarmed in. And when the fighting and the politicking, the boodling, and conspiracies were over, Washington had changed forever from the muddy, dusty, semi-rusticity that inspired travelers' jokes before the war. Of course, Lincoln is the inevitable hero of this story. Brooding in the White House, spending nights at the telegraph office waiting for news from the front, trying out one commanding general after another, studying Napoleon to become his own strategist, struggling with the underlying issue of slavery. Mary Lincoln was both a support and a vexation for him. She ran up huge bills for redecorating the White House and for elaborate gowns to wear as hostess of the public receptions that custom required presidents to hold even amid Civil War. After the Lincoln's bright favorite son, Willie, died of typhoid fever in early 1862, Mrs. Lincoln went into sometimes hysterical mourning. She called in mediums, charlatans who held seances in the White House, convincing her that she could communicate with Willie across the border of life. All around the Lincolns, famous generals like George McClellan, Ben Butler, and U.S. Grant, politicians like Seward and Edmund Stanton and Salmon P. Chase, and underground Confederate agents like Mrs. Greenhow are principal actors in the story of Washington at war. But beyond them, the city was a vanity fair of colorful others. Loyal like General Scott, a Virginian who stayed with the Union. Treacherous like Thomas Nelson Conrad, a young Methodist preacher who ran a boys' school in Georgetown before becoming a Confederate spy. Black heroes like Sojourner Truth, who came to help the freed slaves who crowded into the Capitol and stayed to defy the system of segregation on the city's streetcars. High-minded women like Dorothea Dix, who organized nurses to tend the wounded, and venal deal cutters like Jim Fisk, who made a fortune selling moldy blankets to the Army and illegally buying Confederate cotton across the lines. Just after Fort Sumter, Massachusetts troops rushing from the north to defend Washington were attacked by a secessionist mob in Baltimore as they moved along Pratt Street between railroad stations. For days, Washington was cut off from the rest of the North. When Northern troops finally got here, thousands camped in the very Capitol itself, turning it into One grand water closet, the architect Walter said. The stench is terrible. At times, that was an apt description of the city itself, where raw sewage and dead cows and horses reeked in the sluggish canal that cut across the mall at the foot of Capitol Hill. Before the threats of coups and uprisings were finally laid away, federal police had arrested Washington mayor James Barrett on suspicion of disloyalty. They arrested key members of the Maryland legislature to prevent them from holding a special session to take the state into the Confederacy. Washington was shocked and his generals humiliated when the Confederates sent the Union Army reeling back from Bull Run. The Southern generals had been tipped off by the seductive Rose O'Neal Greenhow, who picked the brains of key politicians like Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. She was arrested and held in the old Capitol Prison, the brick building where the Supreme Court now stands, which had been used by Congress after the British burned the Capitol and White House in 1814. Until the politic moment, Lincoln staved off abolitionist demands for emancipation. But he had signaled that decision by approving the bill to end slavery in the District of Columbia on April 16, 1862, a great day in Washington history. It was the only example of compensated emancipation in American history. The federal government paid district slave owners an average of $300 for each person freed by the act. Those transactions took place at the old City Hall, now the oldest municipal building in the city, on Judiciary Square across from today's Superior Court and Police Headquarters. Lincoln was vilified by many in the Capitol then and 5 months later when he announced the historic Emancipation Proclamation to take effect on New Year's Day, 1863, casting the war for the first time in clear moral proclamation to take effect on New Year's Day, 1863, casting the war for the first time in clear moral terms. Morale in the city roller coasted up and down with news from the front. In more than 40 hospitals, most of them in converted government properties like the Patent Office building, and scattered schools, churches, and hotels, middle-aged ladies took care of the sick and wounded. The rules didn't permit young and attractive ones. But working among them, bringing sweets, writing letters for soldiers, changing their bandages, holding their hands as they suffered, was Government Clerk Walt Whitman, probably America's foremost poet. Old Walt scandalized the ladies. One nurse at Armory Square Hospital wrote, "There comes that odious Walt Whitman to talk evil and unbelief to my boys. I think I'd rather see the evil one himself." Because he was such a free spirit, Whitman had trouble raising funds to help the soldiers. A friend in Boston wrote to him that there's a prejudice against you here among the fine ladies and gentlemen. It's believed you are not afraid of your reproductive organs. After Robert E. Lee defeated Fighting Joe Hooker at Chancellorsville outside Fredericksburg, Whitman described boatloads of Union wounded arriving at the landing at the foot of 6th Street by torchlight in the rain. Today, as I write, hundreds more are expected, said Whitman, and tomorrow and the next day, more, and so on for many days. Quite often they arrive at the rate of 1,000 a day. Lincoln's friend, the correspondent Noah Brooks, was at the White House when news of Chancellorsville arrived. Had a thunderbolt fallen upon the president, he could not have been more overwhelmed, he said. One newly risen from the dead could not have looked more ghost-like. The president agonized, my God, what will the country say?" Within 2 months, the news from Gettysburg and Vicksburg made July 4th, 1863, a day of celebration in the Capitol. And at the Capitol, Thomas Walter's great cast-iron dome had become a visible symbol of Union determination to keep going. In fact, it lifted the seesaw of morale again on December 2nd, 1863, when at last the Statue of Freedom was lifted and mounted atop the completed dome. A booming salute from guns on Capitol Hill was answered by salutes from all the 67 forts around the city. But half a year later, Lincoln had to read the endless casualty lists from U.S. Grant's overland campaign that climaxed in the slaughter pen of Cold Harbor. Boatloads of the wounded and dead crowded the hospitals and mortuaries of Washington. The smell from embalming shops was so depressing that local newspapers complained that the undertakers were spreading pestilence and ruining the business of restaurants. The cemetery at the Soldiers' Home was full, more than full, and soon acres of new graves covered the hills of the Arlington plantation left by Mr. and Mrs. Lee. In a public speech, Lincoln admitted that the spring campaign had carried mourning almost to every home until it can almost be said that the heavens are hung in black. As if that weren't enough misery, at the Washington Arsenal, down where Fort McNair is now, an accidental explosion killed 23 young girls making ammunition, and the president joined a procession of 150 carriages to their funeral in Congressional Cemetery. The very next month, July 1864, Jubal Early's rebel troops thrust into the district at Fort Stevens, out 7th Street, within 5 miles of the White House. The Confederates knew that Grant had stripped the forts about the city of experienced troops. He'd taken artillerymen from all the forts who were used to the soft life of barracks troops and converted them into infantry for his massive overland drive toward Richmond. Volunteers old and young, walking wounded from the hospitals, mechanics and clerks from the Navy Yard and the departments, rushed to confront the Confederates. Lincoln, wearing his stovepipe hat, trotted out to see the fight. He's still the only president ever to face enemy fire while in office, and he came close to losing his life when a doctor standing beside him on the works of Fort Stevens was hit by a sniper's bullet. In the nick of time, reinforcements came up the Potomac from Grant's army in Virginia and drove the rebels back. And so the central story of Washington at war rolled on to the fall of Richmond. Lincoln asked a band serenading him at the White House, celebrating that, to play Dixie, because he said the Attorney General had ruled that the song now belonged to the nation, been captured by the Union Army. And then when it seemed, after Grant drove on, kept going from Richmond to Appomattox, 500 gun salutes shook the windows of the city. And after that, when it seemed that all the gloom and death would last be over, Lincoln himself was cut down by the handsome, arrogant, probably mad John Wilkes Booth. Tragedy piled upon tragedy. Of Lincoln's death, Walt Whitman wrote perhaps his most memorable lines. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. Ever-returning spring, Trinity sure to me you bring, lilac blooming perennial and drooping star in the west, and thought of him I love. It was almost 6 weeks before Washingtonians took down the black bunting that draped the White House and government buildings and hundreds of mourning homes. And then on a splendid morning in May, the soldiers who had saved the Union converged on Washington from south and west. 150,000 of them, beginning with the Army of the Potomac that had fought at Bull Run, Antietam, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, from the Wilderness to Appomattox, marched abreast along the avenue with their torn and bloody battle flags held high. Past the White House they kept on for hours, past Grant, assembled generals, politicians, and the new President Andrew Johnson. And then the second day came the armies of the West, Sherman's heroes who had gutted the Confederacy, the heroes of Shiloh, Chickamauga, Vicksburg, and Atlanta. On and on they came, a seemingly endless stream of manhood. Among them proud black soldiers and hangers-on who brought with them pet goats and eagles who had been with them through the war. Lincoln's secretary, John Hay, thought that no such touching pageant was ever seen. There marched the survivors of battle after battle, and somewhere above them hovered the ghosts of the president and the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who did not survive. The victors and the martyrs, he wrote, out of the army into peace, out of our sorrow into holy memories. And with the sweet and thrilling sounds of all the bugles and the rising dust of the columns smitten into golden glory by the sun setting over Georgetown Heights, passed away the heroic age from Washington. The fortunate spectators at the south end of the Treasury, where the column turned into 15th Street and a slight elevation opened a broad panorama down the avenue, had the best view of the unforgettable cavalcade. From there they watched mile after mile of soldiers advancing toward them, shoulder to shoulder, men whose stride and solidarity symbolized the Union. And soaring beyond the unending lines of blue, gleaming in the clear distance, the great dome of the Capitol stood as it still stands, forever upholding the statue and the promise of freedom. Thanks very much.
You can see the writing on the pavement. Young kids, they're growing up in basements. Online, a whole new generation. I'ma make mine, so you better go take it. Always, they need a new replacement. Decentralized, can't contain it. We're changing lives, yeah, upgrading. Call it suicide of the older generation.
What keeps you up at night, yeah? Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah? Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. Oh, yeah, I think that we've all had enough. Sick of dealing with the old plan. They know that we're calling them wrong. You got me like, oh, yeah, I think that we've all had enough. Sick of dealing with the old plan. They know that we're calling them wrong.
Hey, it's too late to try to go contain it. A generation fueled by creation. We live lives on a small screen nation. We control the airwaves, no negotiation. I refuse to think we need saving. Something good will come from creation. And when we think that the world is too anxious, we'll adapt, evolve, survive, and save it.
What keeps you up at night, yeah? Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah? Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah.